Hurry, before Dad returns, daughter. Those words from her mother were more than just a warning. They were the beginning of a secret she never thought she'd carry. A house filled with silence, a girl torn between fear and desire, and a bond that crossed every line society had drawn. What started as a whisper in the dark grew into something powerful, something forbidden, something that would either destroy them or set them free. This is not just a story about love. It's about the weight of silence, the danger of being discovered, and the hunger for connection when the world says you shouldn't feel it. Every step she took was a risk. Every glance carried 1,000 unspoken words. And every moment stolen from the clock felt like eternity squeezed into seconds. Sometimes love doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives. It defies rules, shatters expectations, and forces you to choose between who you are and who the world wants you to be. This story begins with a mother's trembling voice, a daughter's restless heart, and the secret they swore would never escape the four walls of their home, and once the line was crossed, there was no turning back. The house always felt colder when her father wasn't home, not because the air had shifted but because the silence grew heavier, stretching across the walls like an unspoken warning. She had grown up listening to the sharpness of his footsteps, the way doors slammed when he was in a mood, the way her mother's voice softened to almost nothing whenever he entered a room. On the outside, they looked like a perfect family. People in the neighborhood saw a hardworking man, a patient woman, and a bright young daughter. No one noticed the cracks, and no one would have believed them even if they had. That evening, the rain tapped against the windows, and the smell of something cooking lingered in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, sketching absent-mindedly, when her mother leaned closer and whispered the words that would stay with her forever. Hurry, before Dad returns, daughter. At first, she thought her mother was only talking about chores or maybe hiding something from him, as they often did when they wanted to avoid his anger. But the way her mother's eyes lingered, filled with a mix of fear and longing, told her there was more. It wasn't about a task or an order. It was about them, about a connection neither of them had dared to name before. She looked up, startled, her pencil slipping from her fingers, and in that moment the air between them shifted. It was no longer mother and daughter in the ordinary sense, it was two souls standing at the edge of something dangerous and magnetic. Her mother's hand reached across the table, trembling as it brushed against hers, and though every instinct screamed that it was wrong, another voice inside whispered that it was the only thing that had ever felt right. For years she had been confused by the intensity of her feelings. When she was younger, she dismissed them as admiration, as the way a child idolizes the person who cares for them most. But as she grew older, she started noticing the way her heart raced when her mother tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her body warmed when they stood too close in the kitchen, or the way she felt jealous when her mother laughed too freely with anyone else. She carried this guilt in silence, convinced that she was broken for feeling this way, praying it would go away. But that night, when her mother's voice cracked and her hand lingered, she realized she wasn't alone in it. Her mother felt it too. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, reminding them that time was running out before he returned, and still they sat frozen, staring at each other as though the world outside no longer existed. Her mother's lips parted as if to say more, but instead she withdrew her hand quickly, almost ashamed of what had just happened. She stood and busied herself with the pot on the stove, stirring with unnecessary force, her back turned. But her daughter's chest burned with questions. Why now? Why risk saying something like that? Why let the mask slip when everything could collapse? She rose quietly and stepped behind her mother, close enough to smell the faint perfume mixed with the scent of onions and garlic, close enough to see the tension in her shoulders. She reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on her arm, and for the first time her mother didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she leaned back slightly, as if she needed that touch more than air itself. Neither spoke, but in that silence, everything was said. It was wrong. It was forbidden. Yet it was undeniable. The sound of a car door slamming outside broke the spell, yanking them both back into reality. Her mother turned sharply, her face pale, her voice trembling as she whispered again, "Hurry, before Dad returns." She wasn't just warning her to hide what had happened, she was begging her to guard a secret that could ruin them both. She nodded, her throat dry, her heart still racing, and she stepped back quickly, returning to her seat as though nothing had happened. Her mother wiped her hands on her apron, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and by the time the front door opened, they were two different people again, an obedient daughter and a dutiful wife. But under that mask, something had changed forever. Something they could never take back. The sound of her father's heavy boots against the floorboards filled the room, and for a moment it felt like the house itself held its breath. He greeted them with the same stiff nod he always gave, his words clipped and tired, as though speaking to his family was a chore rather than a comfort. She had long learned how to mask her feelings when he was home. She smiled when she had to, she answered politely when he asked questions, and she never let her voice rise above the quiet tone that kept him calm. Her mother was the same, always careful, always measured, like a shadow walking alongside his presence. Yet underneath the calm surface, her chest still burned with what had just happened in the kitchen. She couldn't stop hearing her mother's voice, couldn't stop feeling the ghost of her mother's hand against hers. The meal passed slowly, each sound exaggerated in the silence. The clatter of a fork against a plate, the scrape of a chair against the floor, the faint hum of the rain outside. She kept her eyes lowered, afraid that if she looked at her mother for too long, he would notice the electricity that seemed to spark in the air between them. She forced food into her mouth, though she could barely taste it. Across the table, her mother moved gracefully, as though nothing had shifted in her world, but every now and then their eyes would meet, just for a heartbeat, and it was enough to make her pulse race. After dinner, he went to his room as he always did, tired from work and eager to rest. The moment the door closed, the house exhaled again. She carried dishes to the sink, and her mother followed, their movements silent and in rhythm, the air thick with unspoken words. As the water ran over the plates, her mother's voice came in a whisper, low enough not to carry beyond the kitchen. "You have to be careful," she said, her back turned as though she were speaking to the sink and not to her daughter. "What happened earlier, you must never let it show." Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask why, wanted to demand answers, but the fear in her mother's voice stopped her. "I know," she replied softly, though the truth was she didn't know. She didn't know why her mother had said those words, why her touch had lingered, why her gaze had burned with something that wasn't motherly at all. She didn't know why she herself had wanted it so badly. That night, she lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the house. She thought about all the moments in the past that made sense now. The way her mother's hugs had sometimes lasted too long, the way her fingers brushed her hair like they were memorizing it, the way she had always been her mother's confidant in a way that seemed deeper than normal. She remembered once, when she was younger, catching her mother looking at her with an expression she hadn't understood then but recognized now, a longing that didn't belong to a parent but to someone who wanted more. The realization was both terrifying and intoxicating. In the days that followed, they moved carefully, almost too carefully. Every routine was the same. Her father went to work early and came back late, her mother filled the hours with cooking and cleaning, and she tried to stay busy with schoolwork. But between them, every touch, every glance carried a weight. A brush of fingers when passing a plate, a gaze that lingered too long across the room, a shared silence that said more than words ever could. They never spoke of it directly, but the tension grew stronger, stretching thin like glass that could shatter at the smallest crack. One afternoon, while her father was away, she found herself in the living room reading. Her mother entered quietly, sitting beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. The air between them grew thick, heavy, as though the walls themselves knew the secret they carried. Her mother's hand moved slowly, deliberately, covering hers. This time, there was no hesitation, no trembling. It was steady, intentional. Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse roaring in her ears. She knew it was dangerous, knew they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, yet she didn't pull away. She couldn't. The warmth of her mother's skin against hers was too powerful, too consuming. Minutes passed in silence, both of them staring forward as though pretending nothing had happened, yet their hands remained locked together. When at last her mother spoke, her voice was hoarse, broken by emotions she had tried to bury for too long. "I don't know how much longer I can hide this," she whispered. Her chest tightened, her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to say she felt the same, that she had been drowning in these feelings too, that she had thought she was alone until now. But before she could speak, the sound of a car passing outside made them flinch, breaking their stillness. Her mother pulled her hand back sharply, rising to her feet, and in that instant the spell was broken again. Yet the truth was undeniable. Something was unfolding between them, something they could not stop, and no matter how much they tried to push it down, it kept finding its way back to the surface. That night, as she lay in bed, she no longer questioned whether this was real. She knew. And she also knew that from now on, nothing would ever be the same again. The days began to blur into one another, but inside her heart every moment felt heightened, as if she were living in a constant storm of emotion. She woke each morning to the sound of her father's footsteps leaving for work and felt the weight of relief wash over her as the door closed behind him. She knew that the hours which followed would carry both danger and temptation. The house was quiet in his absence, but silence no longer meant emptiness. It meant possibility. It meant the air charged with tension, glances that lingered, touches that could not be explained. She found herself drawn to the spaces her mother occupied, inventing reasons to be near her. Helping with laundry, peeling vegetables at the counter, carrying books into the living room, every excuse felt justified in her mind, even though she knew the real reason she lingered was because she craved her mother's nearness in ways she could not put into words. Her mother, too, seemed unable to keep the walls she had built standing. There were moments when she was distant, her voice steady and her hands occupied, as if she were determined to bury whatever had risen between them. But then there were other moments, fleeting and impossible to ignore, when her eyes softened, when her hand brushed against her daughter's in a way that felt deliberate, when the air between them grew so heavy it seemed to press down on their chests. One afternoon the weight of their silence broke. She was sitting at the edge of the bed in her room, flipping through a worn book she had already read 3 times, when the door opened quietly. Her mother stepped inside without knocking, her expression unreadable, her hands nervously twisting the edge of her apron. She sat beside her, close enough that the mattress dipped, close enough that the familiar warmth filled the space between them. Neither spoke at first. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second a reminder of the forbidden space they were stepping into. Her mother's voice finally came, low and hesitant. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, her eyes fixed on her lap. "But I can't stop how I feel when I'm near you." The words hit her like a wave, breaking through the doubts she had carried for so long. It wasn't just in her head. It wasn't a mistake, or a figment of her imagination. Her mother felt it too. Her heart pounded so violently she thought her chest might burst. She reached out, trembling, and placed her hand over her mother's. For a long moment neither of them moved, the warmth of their skin saying all the things they were too afraid to voice. When her mother finally lifted her eyes, there was no denying the truth. Longing, sorrow, and a dangerous kind of love swirled together, raw and exposed. The moment stretched between them like fragile glass, beautiful and terrifying. Then, as if pulled by something stronger than reason, her mother leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against her daughter's. It was not a kiss, not yet, but it was enough to shatter the barrier they had been clinging to. She closed her eyes, feeling her mother's breath against her skin, and for the first time she did not feel ashamed. She felt alive. The spell was broken suddenly by the sound of a car horn in the distance, reminding them both of the world outside their small room. Her mother pulled back sharply, her hands trembling as she stood. "We can't let him know," she whispered, her voice desperate, her eyes filled with fear. "If he ever found out," she didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken words were clear. Discovery would mean destruction. Yet as she watched her mother's figure retreat through the doorway, she knew there was no going back to the way things had been. That night she lay awake replaying the moment in her mind, the closeness of their foreheads pressed together, the vulnerability in her mother's eyes. It consumed her, filling every thought, every breath. She knew it was wrong in the eyes of the world, knew that if anyone else ever learned the truth, they would call it twisted, shameful. But to her, it was the most honest thing she had ever known. Days passed, and with each one the bond between them grew stronger, though it remained hidden beneath careful masks. In front of her father, they were the picture of normalcy, a dutiful wife, a respectful daughter, a family unremarkable in every way. But when he was gone, when the walls closed in and the silence returned, they allowed themselves small fragments of truth. A hand brushing against a shoulder and not pulling away. A shared look that lasted too long. A whispered conversation in the dim light of the kitchen. Each fragment was dangerous, each fragment a risk, but neither of them could resist. The danger only made it more consuming. And in her heart, she began to understand something she had always feared to admit: this wasn't just longing. It wasn't just a fleeting desire or a mistake they could forget. This was love, raw and terrifying, born out of silence and secrecy, but love nonetheless. And it was growing stronger by the day. The air in the house became heavier with every passing day, not because of storms outside or arguments within, but because of the weight of what was silently blooming in the shadows. She noticed how her mother's presence had begun to affect her more than she ever imagined it could. It was in the way her heart skipped whenever her mother entered the room, the way her throat tightened when their eyes met across the table, the way her chest warmed when her mother's laughter broke through the suffocating silence of the house. The smallest things carried meaning now. A shared smile over a private thought. A brush of the shoulder in a narrow hallway. Even the act of washing dishes side by side became something loaded, filled with a tension that neither of them dared to put into words. Her father remained blind to all of it, too caught in his own world of work, fatigue, and routine. His presence was like a looming storm cloud, always near, always capable of breaking, yet never aware of the delicate world forming just beyond his sight. In his absence, though, something more dangerous had begun to unfold. It was a slow unraveling, a dangerous surrender that neither of them seemed strong enough to stop. One evening, when the rain returned and the house smelled faintly of wet earth, she found herself sitting in the living room with her mother. The lamp cast a soft glow, painting the room in gold and shadow. Her mother had been sewing, but her hands stilled on the fabric as her gaze lifted and settled on her daughter. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was not empty, it was charged, almost unbearable. Then, her mother's voice broke it, fragile but steady. "Do you ever wonder why we feel this way?" she asked softly, her words trembling as though she feared their very existence. Her breath caught. She had thought about it endlessly, but to hear her mother say it aloud felt like stepping off a ledge with no promise of landing. All the time, she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "And I don't have an answer. I only know I can't stop." Her mother's eyes closed briefly, her chest rising and falling as though she were carrying a weight too heavy to hold. "We shouldn't," she murmured, "but I can't either." Those words hung in the air between them, both terrifying and liberating. It was the first time they had acknowledged the truth openly, the first time they had dared to give shape to the feelings that had consumed them silently. Her mother set the sewing aside, her hands trembling, and leaned back against the chair. Her face was pale but her eyes glistened with a mixture of fear and longing. "If anyone knew," she whispered, "we would be destroyed." Her throat tightened, but she found herself leaning closer anyway, her heart hammering in her chest. "Then no one can ever know," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "It will be our secret." Her mother's hand found hers, slowly, almost uncertainly, but when their fingers intertwined, the room seemed to tilt, the air growing heavier with unspoken desire. The warmth of her mother's touch burned into her skin, and this time neither of them pulled away. Minutes passed in silence, but their hands remained locked, and in that fragile connection, an unbreakable truth was formed. The days that followed grew even more dangerous. They no longer avoided each other's gaze, they sought it. They no longer pretended their touches were accidental, they lingered. In the quiet corners of the house, in the brief moments when her father was gone, they allowed themselves to taste the forbidden closeness they both craved. A gentle brush of lips against a forehead. A hand resting too long on a shoulder. A whispered word spoken too near the ear. Each act left them trembling, guilty and exhilarated at once, but neither could stop. The pull between them had grown stronger than their fear. At night, when she lay in bed, she thought about what they were risking. She imagined the fury in her father's eyes if he ever discovered the truth. She imagined the shame, the judgment, the condemnation if anyone else ever saw them for what they had become. Yet none of those thoughts outweighed the memory of her mother's touch, her warmth, her eyes filled with a love that refused to be buried. And in her heart, she began to realize something even more dangerous than the love itself. She no longer wanted to stop. The danger only deepened the bond. It was no longer something that happened by accident or in fleeting moments. It was becoming deliberate, intentional, a choice they both made each time their hands reached for one another, each time their lips brushed in the safety of shadows. What had begun as silence had now become something that could no longer be denied. And though the world outside their home would never forgive it, inside those walls it was becoming the only truth that mattered. The change in their world was subtle, invisible to anyone who might have looked from the outside, yet inside it was as if the house had shifted into another universe. What had once been routine now pulsed with an undercurrent of desire and fear. She woke each morning not with the dull weight of another day, but with a restless energy that came from knowing her mother would be there, waiting in the kitchen, moving with quiet grace, glancing at her with eyes that now carried meaning far beyond ordinary love. Even simple things, passing a cup, folding laundry side by side, brushing past one another in the hallway, were filled with a hidden electricity that both of them felt but never spoke of when her father was home. They had become experts at masks. Her mother's voice softened into duty when he was around, her hands moving quickly with chores, her face composed and unreadable. She too wore her disguise well, pretending to be the obedient daughter, head bent over schoolwork or chores, responding to her father's questions with quick, neutral answers. Yet beneath it all, in the hidden glances, in the stolen touches when he looked away, their truth remained. It was a dangerous dance, one where every step carried the risk of collapse. One afternoon when the house was filled with the hum of quiet, her father gone for work as usual, she walked into the kitchen and found her mother staring out the window, her hands gripping the counter. There was a stillness about her, but also a heaviness, as if she were wrestling with something impossible to put into words. She hesitated at the doorway, but the pull was too strong, and she stepped closer, her heart pounding with every movement. When she touched her mother's arm lightly, her mother turned, her eyes glassy, filled with something between fear and longing. "This is wrong," her mother whispered, but even as she said it her hand reached out and held her daughter's. "I know," she whispered back, her voice trembling, "but it feels more real than anything else." The honesty in that moment tore away what little walls they had left. Her mother pulled her into an embrace, and she melted into it, burying her face into the warmth that had always been home but now carried something far deeper, far more dangerous. Her mother's lips brushed her temple in a touch that was half maternal, half desperate, and it left her dizzy with the weight of it all. They stayed like that for a long time, pressed together in silence, both knowing they had crossed another line they could never return from. That night she lay in bed replaying every second, her body aching with the memory of her mother's arms, the softness of her breath against her skin. She thought of all the stories she had heard about love, about passion, about longing, and realized none of them could compare to what she was living. It was not a fairy tale, it was not gentle or safe. It was dangerous, forbidden, a fire burning in a locked room, but it was hers. And more than anything, she wanted more of it. Days blurred into nights, and the secrecy became their world. They found new ways to speak without words. A lingering glance while setting the table meant, "I need you." A brush of fingers while passing in the hallway meant, "I'm thinking of you." A quiet pause in the middle of chores, just long enough to stand too close, meant, "I can't stay away." The hunger between them grew stronger with each passing day, each attempt to hold back only making the need more unbearable. The risk, the silence, the secrecy, it all fed into the intensity, making every moment together feel like stolen treasure. Yet alongside the thrill was fear, a gnawing fear that never left them. She sometimes caught her mother staring off into the distance, her brow furrowed, her hands trembling slightly as though she were haunted by the danger of what they were doing. And she understood, because she too lay awake at night imagining what would happen if her father discovered the truth. The violence of his anger, the ruin of their lives, the shame that would follow. But even those thoughts were not strong enough to silence the pull between them. It was stronger than reason, stronger than fear, stronger than the walls of the house that held their secret. It was in their blood now, flowing through every word, every touch, every heartbeat. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew it, they were no longer just walking on the edge of a forbidden desire. They were falling. And the deeper they fell, the less they wanted to be saved. The days grew heavier, as if every sunrise carried more weight than the one before. What had begun as glances and small touches was now consuming every hour of their lives. She felt it in her bones, in the restless way she waited for her father's car to disappear down the street each morning, in the fire that burned in her chest whenever her mother entered the room. She tried to hide it, to bury it in schoolwork or chores, but nothing could quiet the storm inside. Her mother tried too. She saw it in the way she busied herself with endless cleaning, cooking, folding, as if keeping her hands occupied could silence her heart. But the silence between them betrayed them both. Every moment when they were alone was louder than words, filled with a gravity that pulled them closer no matter how they resisted. One afternoon the weight became unbearable. She was in her room, sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring blankly at the pages of a book she hadn't turned in 10 minutes, when the door creaked open. Her mother stepped inside, her face pale and drawn, her hands wringing together nervously. She closed the door behind her, and the sound seemed to seal them off from the rest of the world. For a long time neither spoke. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the wall, the steady rhythm of their breaths. Then, slowly, her mother crossed the room and sat beside her. The mattress dipped under the weight, and the warmth of her presence filled the space. Her mother's hands trembled in her lap, and her voice came out as little more than a whisper. "I can't keep pretending." The words sliced through the silence like lightning. Her chest tightened, her breath caught, and she turned to face her mother. "Neither can I," she admitted, her voice shaking. The air between them thickened, suffocating with truth. Her mother's eyes glistened, tears threatening to fall, but there was also a fire there, a longing that could no longer be denied. She reached out, slowly, cautiously, as if touching her daughter again would unravel everything, and yet she could not stop herself. Their hands met, fingers intertwining, and for a moment the world outside no longer existed. Her heart pounded in her chest, her skin burning where they touched. This time, her mother did not pull away. Instead she leaned closer, her forehead brushing against her daughter's, and the closeness was almost unbearable. Her breath came quick and shallow, and for the first time her lips parted with words that had haunted her for months. "I love you," she whispered, and though the words were simple, they shook her entire being. She closed her eyes, letting the tears escape down her cheeks, and whispered back, "I love you too." It was the truth, raw and dangerous, and once spoken it could never be undone. They held each other tightly, both trembling, both afraid, but neither willing to let go. It was as if their hearts had been waiting for this moment, aching for release, and now that it had arrived, nothing else mattered. Yet in the back of her mind, fear still lurked like a shadow. Fear of discovery, fear of judgment, fear of the man whose footsteps could return at any moment. And she could feel that same fear in her mother's embrace, the way her hands clutched desperately as though holding on to something fleeting. They both knew the risk, but neither could silence the truth any longer. From that night onward, something shifted. They no longer pretended to themselves. They no longer denied what they felt when their hands brushed or their eyes met. They stole moments with intention now, carving out fragments of time where they could exist without masks. In the kitchen, her mother's hand would linger too long on her back. In the living room, their eyes would lock in silence that said everything words couldn't. At night, when the house was quiet and her father slept, she could sometimes hear the faint sound of her mother's sobs from the other room, the kind of sobs that came not from regret but from the weight of loving someone she should not love. She lay awake listening, her own heart breaking, knowing that what they shared was both their greatest joy and their greatest burden. The secret between them grew heavier, but so did their devotion. And though every instinct told them they were heading toward disaster, neither could find the strength to stop. It was no longer a question of if they would fall, it was only a question of how far. The secret had become a living thing inside the house, breathing in every room, filling every shadow, pressing against them with a force they could no longer contain. What had started as stolen touches and whispered words had now grown into a hunger that neither of them could quiet. Each day felt like a balancing act, their lives split in two, the perfect mask when her father was home, the undeniable truth when he was gone. It was dangerous, exhausting, but it was also intoxicating. Every hour they were apart was a slow ache, every moment they were together felt like the world had stopped spinning. She began to notice the way her mother's voice softened only when speaking to her, the way her eyes seemed alive in those stolen moments, brighter than she ever saw them with anyone else. She realized with growing certainty that what bound them wasn't just desire, it was love, fierce and desperate, the kind of love that people wrote about in stories but that could never be spoken aloud in the real world. And her mother, though careful and always watchful, no longer fought it as she once had. She had surrendered too, piece by piece, until there was no denying what lived between them. One night, when the air was thick with summer heat and the windows were cracked open to let in the faint sound of crickets, she found herself restless, unable to sleep. The house was quiet, her father's snores echoing faintly from the far end of the hall, but her chest burned with an ache she couldn't ignore. She rose quietly, her bare feet soft against the floor, and slipped into the hallway. A faint glow spilled from under her mother's door. She hesitated only a second before knocking softly. The door opened, and her mother stood there in the dim light, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face weary but gentle. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. Her mother stepped aside, letting her in, and closed the door with the carefulness of someone who knew how dangerous sound could be. They stood in silence, the air thick with everything they were too afraid to say, until finally her mother reached out and pulled her close. The embrace was different this time. It was not tentative, not trembling with hesitation, but full, consuming, a release of everything they had held back. She melted into it, her face pressed against her mother's chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist, her body trembling with the intensity of the moment. Her mother's hand stroked her hair, slow and steady, and she could feel her heartbeat pounding through her skin. "I don't know how long we can keep this," her mother whispered into the silence, her voice breaking. But right now, I can't let go. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling freely, because she understood. This was fragile, dangerous, doomed in so many ways, but it was also the only thing that felt real. She lifted her face, their eyes meeting in the dim glow, and before she could think, before she could doubt, their lips brushed for the first time. It was soft, fleeting, trembling with fear, but it was real. The taste of it lingered, shaking her to her core, and when her mother pulled back, her face was streaked with tears. They sat together on the edge of the bed, holding hands in silence, both shaken, both changed. What they had crossed could never be undone. There was no pretending anymore, no way to convince themselves that this was something they could bury. They had stepped into a place from which there was no return, and though fear clawed at them, so did an overwhelming certainty: they belonged to each other. The days after that kiss were heavier, charged with an intensity that left her dizzy. Every glance carried memory. Every brush of skin was fire. They spoke little of what had happened, but they didn't need to. The silence between them had become a language of its own, one that only they understood. Yet beneath it all was a constant tension, a fear that grew sharper with every step her father took, every time his eyes swept over them as if searching for cracks in the mask. She lay awake at night haunted by the sound of the front door opening, by the thought of what would happen if he ever caught them, if he ever saw the truth they carried in secret. And yet, even with the fear, even with the risk, she knew there was no undoing it now. Her mother's love was hers, and hers was her mother's, and nothing, not shame, not fear, not the threat of discovery, could erase the truth that had bound them together. It was a truth stronger than reason, stronger than the walls of the house that held them captive. It was dangerous. It was forbidden. But it was theirs. The summer stretched on, thick and suffocating, as if time itself had slowed to trap them in the fragile world they had built behind closed doors. Every day felt like a test of endurance, balancing the masks they wore for her father with the undeniable truth that bound them together when he was gone. She noticed how her mother's movements grew sharper whenever he was near, how her smile never reached her eyes, how the softness that had become theirs alone vanished the second his shadow filled the room. It was as though they lived in two separate realities, one of silence and duty, the other of fire and forbidden love, and each day the line between them became harder to hold. The kiss they had shared in the safety of her mother's room haunted her constantly. It replayed in her mind with a vividness that stole her breath, keeping her awake long into the night, filling her chest with both longing and fear. It had not been just a fleeting mistake, it was a declaration, one that changed everything. She could still feel the trembling of her mother's lips against hers, the tears that had mixed with their breaths, the overwhelming sense that they had crossed into a place that could never be undone. And though part of her feared it, another part clung to it desperately, unwilling to imagine a life without it. The tension inside the house began to build to unbearable heights. Her father grew suspicious, not of the truth, they were too careful for that, but of the distance he sensed without understanding. He began to question more often, asking why they always seemed so quiet, why her mother's eyes often looked distant, why his daughter seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. His voice carried more edge, his footsteps more weight. She could feel the danger circling closer, as though the house itself were tightening around them. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the house filled with the golden glow of dusk, she found herself alone with her mother in the kitchen. The smell of food filled the air, but neither of them moved with the same rhythm they once had. They were restless, uneasy, aware of how fragile everything had become. Her mother turned suddenly, her face pale, her eyes searching. "We can't keep this forever," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's only a matter of time before something breaks." The words stabbed at her chest, but she knew they were true. "I don't want to lose this," she said, her own voice cracking. Her mother stepped closer, her hands trembling as they reached for hers. Neither do I. You're the only thing that feels alive to me. But we're trapped in a world that would never forgive us. Their eyes locked, and in that moment it felt as though the walls had disappeared, leaving only the two of them standing in a fragile, dangerous truth. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against her mother's, just as they had done before, and for a moment all fear fell away. All that remained was the undeniable bond between them, a bond stronger than reason, stronger than the rules of the world outside their door. That night, after her father had gone to bed, she found her way once more into her mother's room. The silence of the house was deafening, every creak of the floorboards a reminder of the risk they carried. Yet when the door closed behind her and she slipped into her mother's arms, the fear melted into something softer, something unshakable. They lay together in silence, their breaths mingling, their hands entwined, their hearts beating in the same rhythm. It was not just desire now, it was devotion, carved deep into their souls, a truth that neither shame nor fear could erase. In the quiet, her mother whispered words that would stay with her forever. No matter what happens, remember this, you are my love. The world can never take that from us. Tears filled her eyes as she clung tighter, knowing that the road ahead would not be easy, knowing that discovery or loss could come at any moment, but also knowing that nothing would ever erase what had grown between them. They had become something the world would never understand, something too dangerous to name, yet too powerful to destroy. And as the night wrapped around them, heavy and endless, she understood with certainty that this was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of a love that defied everything, a love born in silence and carried in secret, a love that burned brighter because it had to hide in the shadows.